thank you so much, Deborah. It's such an honor to be here for not just the centenary, the 100th year anniversary, but also this whole issue of bringing a human-centered perspective at the heart of how we rethink. And I like how you said it's not the new social contract, but a revived, re-strengthened one. And for me, what's going to be very important, very important to find the clicker, is to think about the need to really rethink so much the narrative, the discourse, and the frameworks we have of how to talk about wealth creation itself, value creation itself. I am not a big fan, by the way, and sorry, I have to be a bit provocative, otherwise we're all going to get bored and fall asleep, of the word regulating. Because by definition, it means that something happens somewhere, and then you regulate it in order to make sure that the outcomes are fair, good, in whatever way one defines that. If we actually really have a human-centered agenda and talk about the need, not just to think about redistribution in order to get fairness, but kind of the pre-distribution, the real understanding of value as being created collectively through the tripartite system, so labor, the public sector, business, then it actually requires really having a co-creation framework and then questioning these words like regulation and intervention as though the market is there and then re-regulate it to get the good outcomes. So what does a co-creation agenda look like? What does it mean to revive also the kind of debate, the contested nature of what is value in the first place? And so that's what I want to do. Oops, I should have started with the first slide. And so I'm going to focus on, as an industrial economist, my area is the economics of innovation. I'm going to focus on this whole idea of what does innovation-led growth look like? Why is it different from the kinds of growth we've actually had? But especially, what does it mean to really contest the direction of innovation, given that innovation and growth, as you know, have not just a rate, but a direction, and look at this public, private, labor, increasingly also third sector, other third sector institutions, how they're governed, how they relate to each other, how that itself determines the direction of innovation and the kinds of market outcomes we get. And this is a really, in some ways, exciting era, if one could call it that, to talk about this, because after the financial crisis, which still has its remnants being felt all over the world, there was, one could say, a consensus that it's not enough to talk about growth. There's all sorts of problematic types of growth. In fact, there was plenty of growth that led just before we had the bursting, if you want, of the crisis. So these words about we need a different type of growth, innovation-led and directing that innovation. We need green growth, sustainable growth. We need inclusive growth with more, not less equity. This is really being talked about in a way, in some ways, more than has ever been talked about. And the fact that we have all these different countries that have actually agreed on 17 sustainable development goals with 169 targets beneath them. Wow, this is the opportunity to really talk again about the social contract, collective value creation, markets as outcomes. And this idea that the social contract has to be at the center of the discussion, I think is central. And to have this human-centered agenda looking at capabilities, institutions, and the different types of contracts, accounting rules, incentives that are needed for a decent and sustainable work that is in this fantastic report that came out earlier this year is central to that discussion. But to also make sure that this doesn't just become a comfortable, kind of cozy discussion where everyone kind of nods their heads, yep, social contract, yep, we need new kind of, the tripartite system, et cetera. But to really make sure that we also use this opportunity to be a thorn in the side of the system to create lots of uncomfortable conversations, then I will try to provoke you a bit and to say that this is going to be impossible unless we debunk and rethink literally the words that we're using to talk about value in the first place. And not so much, to be honest, the ILO, but definitely those places in the world, those tables around the world where we talk about innovation, where we talk about fairness, where we talk about well-being. It's sometimes a bit too comfortable. So in making it uncomfortable, what I really want to also show is that there's just so much kind of, I was about to say swear word, but I realize we should be proper here, but there's lots of, just stories that are being told. In fact, if you look at Piketty's book, which is a fantastic book for the data that it showed in terms of the increases in inequality basically since the 1970s, you can actually trace the stories, the narratives, the discourses that were told about wealth creation, about innovation, in particular decades when some of the most regressive taxation policies were introduced. I often tell the story of what happened in the US, for example, at the end of the 1970s, where in just 4 years, the capital gains tax was reduced by 50% in just 4 years, huge reduction in 4 years, through the actual lobbying and storytelling of a particular part of the financial sector. It was the National Venture Capital Association that had just formed and basically made it its kind of remit to make sure that they lobbied for a tax cut that basically ended up just increasing profits in the sector. It wasn't actually what catalyzed the investment of their own area. And so making sure that we kind of listen to Plato, smart guy, and make sure that we, if you want, correlate our understandings of inequality with the ways that we talk about growth, innovation, wealth, and value. And I often say to my policymaker friends who deal with innovation policy, be careful. Some of the stupidest things are done in the name of innovation and creativity and dynamism. And so what I'll repeat, you'll probably get sick of it, and I've been given a huge amount of time, so I'm going to try to be shorter than what I've been given so we can actually have as much discussion as possible. But I'll be repeating these words quite a bit throughout my talk, which is, to really rethink what does it mean to talk about value as collectively created. So stakeholder governance, okay, we get that. Varieties of capitalism, shareholder versus stakeholder. But what is the value theory, the framework, the practice that needs to be implemented to really understand how value is created through the investment and the capabilities, the opportunities of all these different actors in the economy? If we don't get that, it's all just going to be talk. What does it mean to look at markets, not as business, but markets themselves as outcomes of how public, private, labor, and other institutions come together and how they themselves are governed? There's all sorts of decisions to be made and how we govern our institutions, not just private institutions, but there's governance structures within the public sector. What kind of governance structures do we need inside government and all the different public entities in order to help drive markets to become ones that lead to more sustainable and inclusive growth? So there's lots of debate about corporate governance. Where's the debate about public governance? There's lots of different ways to do that. And you only start asking those difficult questions when you admit that even the public sector, when it's organized and structured in particular ambitious ways, can be an active co-creator of growth. Not just a regulator, not just an enabler, not just a facilitator, not just getting the rules of the game right, and leveling the playing field, all these incredibly boring words that somehow we've all accepted. And what does it mean to actually, again, I've said this already, to really admit that innovation has not just a rate but a direction, and putting labor and the social contract at the center of the discussions about growth and the Green New Deal, which I'll get to later, really means to make sure that labor is at the table, not just ex post, fighting for what is a good fight, the just transition, but even defining the green transition in the first place. What is green? What do we mean by that? We cannot allow these interesting, creative conversations to happen in one place and then others in another place, making sure it leads to the just transition, as important as that fight is. So what I'm going to do now is depress you a bit. I must say you don't look that happy in the first place, so you look a bit serious here. But at least you're not all men in suits, which unfortunately my last two talks in the last 2 days, that's all I saw. So I'm going to first depress you a bit with just making sure we remember how bad things are around these issues of how we're governing particular institutions and how they're relating to each other, because if we don't admit that, it's going to be hard to solve it. Like I've seen this in movies, I promise I haven't been to one of these myself, but in Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, they begin with, "My name is Joe, I'm an alcoholic." And so let's first just admit just how bad things are in order to then get focused on what needs to happen. Then I want to link these problems, these 5 big problems, to how we think about value, how we currently think about markets, even in progressive quarters when we slip up and use some boring words, which become part of the problem, because words are not neutral. And I want to then kind of present an alternative way to think about the economy, of markets, of wealth, of value, actually reviving lots of old debates. This often happens when we want to sound exciting and new. We end up picking some interesting things that people said 200 years ago, and hey, wasn't that interesting? And it's not about being romantic about it, but just kind of bringing back that debate to the center, and I will call this the value debate, and making sure we don't con ourselves by accepting how value is talked about. And in talking about this new framework, I then want to give some examples. And I've had the luxury over the last year and a half of being kind of at the center of some big European debates, and also using this to think about global missions around the Sustainable Development Goals, and European debates about how to redirect innovation policy to actually produce very specific outcomes that we need in order to live in a world that is more inclusive and more sustainable. And this is through this concept of missions, which was actually voted on by the European Parliament and the European Council, which is now an instrument, a legal instrument through which to change how we think about innovation and how we redirect those investments. But especially, I think the opportunity, it's not necessarily there yet, I need to still be a bigger thorn in the side, how we change the relationships between business, labor, and government. Okay, big problems. I'm going to be very superficial here, or not, I shouldn't say superficial, a bit quick. So forgive me, obviously these problems are deeper than the time that I will give them. So the first is kind of what I would call one face of a huge global trend called financialization. And so the first face is what it means for the financial sector. And this is basically that finance has not been doing its job. It has not actually been financing what Hyman Minsky called the capital development of the economy, but has to a large extent been financing itself. And this is not just the Anglo-Saxon economies like the UK and the US, but unfortunately what we see is in many different economies, definitely in Europe, but also in other places in the world, as they advance and as the financial sector becomes more developed, it actually also becomes more dysfunctional at the same time. This data here is from Andy Haldane's work. He's the chief economist in the Bank of England. This pertains to the UK, just showing how much financial intermediation, and looking at it as basically the widely defined financial sector, not just banking, has outpaced the growth of the real economy. And one could say, oh, well, that's fine as long as it's actually investing in things in the real economy. But actually, finance has been financing finance, insurance, and real estate. Very aptly, the acronym is FIRE, to scare people. And so this is a huge problem. And unfortunately, what this often leads to, and just to give you a sense of the problem, only about 20%, between 15 and 20% of finance in the UK actually goes back into the real economy. The rest just literally goes back to the financial sector itself. And so what this sometimes leads to is this idea of, this is why we need industrial policy. This is why we need to nurture industry, right? The makers, not the takers. So the hedge funds, the credit default swaps are seen as the problem, and then industry, we need to, if you want, funnel the finance back to industry. And here we have the second problem, that industry itself, and I'm thinking globally here, I'm talking about the large companies, for example, those that are listed in the S&P 500 index, but because of global value chains have impacts all across the world, they have increasingly not been reinvesting their own profits back into the real economy, but into areas that just boost share prices, stock options, surprise, surprise, executive pay. And the data, you know it, it's been talked about a lot in the last years, about the 1%, the 99%, and this is very much part of this problem. Now what this graph shows you here, and this is from the work of Bill Lazonick, who I've also worked with quite a bit on this problem, and the problem is much worse than this, by the way. The actual new numbers are 4 trillion. So $4 trillion have been spent on buybacks in the last decade, between 2008 and 2018. This data here is between 2003 and 2012, which was the data he used for this actual article. Now, what you want to look at here is the yellow. The yellow is profits reinvested. Now, reinvested back into skills, in training, and all the different areas that are really highlighted in the Global Commission's report on the future of work. Those profits have been increasingly not reinvested back into R&D, skills, and training, but into these areas like share buybacks. And in many areas like health, the worst are health and energy. When you ask the companies, why are you doing this? Why not reinvest your profits? The answer is there's no opportunities for investment. So this is the right thing to do, to give the money back to the shareholders. This idea that there's no opportunities is exactly the opposite of what you'll be talking about in the next 3 days. There's huge opportunities. And my the book I wrote on the entrepreneurial state kind of mapped out these massive opportunities that we have ahead, but also how in the past, the opportunities that then got us the internet revolution, the nanotech revolution, the biotech revolution, the clean tech revolution that we're kind of experiencing today actually required a huge amount of reinvestment of profits by the business sector itself, as well as, of course, very active, strategic, high-risk, early-stage public investments. Now, what you see, this data here at the macroeconomic level, and you really see this globally, this isn't just for the US, even though this data here is for the US, is a fall in business investment. So remember, GDP can be calculated in different ways. And if you look at the I bit, right, C plus I plus G plus X minus M, I has been falling. By the way, I'm not a big fan of saying GDP is crap, we got to get rid of it, introduce all this happiness. I'm more of a fan of saying, let's use GDP for what it was meant to do. And Kuznets was very clear, don't use it for the reasons that today we're using it, but it can actually be used to really reveal these kinds of patterns. But this is not on the front page of any of the papers that very comfortably then talk about well-being and happiness. And I don't want to dismiss the well-being point, but let's first at least really get a bit more frightened by what even GDP can show. In the UK, for example, if you took GDP seriously, even with its limited framings, you would see something else. Growth is growing through consumption, not investment. And that consumption is being fueled by private debt. So the ratio of private debt to disposable income in the UK is back at record levels. And what caused the financial crisis? That, right? Even though they obsess then about austerity and the public debt, the cause was private debt. And you can see that in GDP. But is that being talked about? Is that on the front page even of the New York Times or The Economist? No. Two papers that have, however, been willing to embrace this notion of well-being and happiness. So let's not be part of the problem by creating comforts in certain zones. We need to also be able to reveal the hugely dysfunctional dynamics, even with existing metrics, and then get much, much, much better metrics, accounting rules, and relationships in order to achieve the goals that we set ourselves. The third problem is inequality, and I'm not going to talk about that too much because you are, in some ways, the global group that has been putting this at the center of the economic stage way before Piketty's great book on this. But of course, one of the biggest causes, of course, is that real wages have not been keeping up with increases in productivity. So workers have not been getting their fair share of the wealth that they have themselves have created. And this is, by the way, why even though UBI, Universal Basic Income, has all sorts of positive reasons behind it, it's not a coincidence that Silicon Valley loves UBI. It's just sort of seen as a handout, right? Let's give a handout back to the people, and wealth is still created in places like Silicon Valley. Whereas what this shows is people who have massively co-created the wealth of the last decades have not gotten their fair share, their dividend of that. That is not about a handout. That's getting their fair share of the wealth that has been created. And this is something I'll come back to in terms of the narrative behind it. Then, of course, there's the climate problem. And this, again, you don't need me to tell you about this. And if you haven't, I'm sure you have. If you haven't, read it, the IPCC report, which is really stark. We've got 12 years left. And even though I've written a lot about these previous technological revolutions, they didn't have the urgency. We need to get our acts together now. Right? In 12 years, we need to be able to do what some other sectors maybe took 30 years, and that is not impossible. But it does absolutely require a change in governance of all these different organizations, and both business and public labor organizations themselves rethinking their role in that process, and the philanthropies, which are increasingly important in this space, rethinking some of the damage they themselves are doing by just kind of patching things up along the way and not being, again, a big thorn in the side of the governance structures in the business community around the data that I just showed before. In fact, lots of philanthropic funds themselves, as you probably know, come from those dysfunctional ways in which finance has been working, so private equity, and then the profits, part of them, are diverted to create some sort of social impact, as opposed to really changing how the value chains themselves are working. And lastly, the state, sorry if this looks a bit odd, the state itself is a problem, and this is something I've, again, written about endlessly. If you're interested, I can give you some references, but the idea that, the state is there to kind of pick up the mess, or as economists would call, fix the different market failures that happen along the way, is part of the problem. Precisely if we look at markets as actually being outcomes, we'll come back to this in a second, then what you really need are a different type of tools from those that are just about fixing. And it's not that these different market failures don't exist, they do. In fact, this framework is not useless, we shouldn't throw it out, but let's just use it for what it can do, which is kind of incremental change. So the reason I sound American, but I promise I'm Italian, born in Italy, Italian parents. I'm even married to an Italian, have 4 kids who all speak Italian, even though we live in London. Anyway, that's too much information there. The reason I speak Italian is because my father does nuclear fusion, which is basic research. And as we know, the private sector doesn't fund it because it's basically a public good. It's very hard to appropriate the returns just for yourself for something that creates such high knowledge spillovers. And so you have underinvestment by the private sector in areas like basic research. State comes in, bang, funds that. So the Department of Energy funds nuclear fusion. We moved to Princeton, New Jersey because of that. And very little controversy over this. Have you ever heard of people fighting whether the state should be funding basic research or not? It's basically accepted. Negative externalities, the opposite. Too much investment, too much production in the private sector of some things that are bad and create negative externalities, so the state has to come in and fix that problem with something like a carbon tax or dissuade the creation of something bad. Then you have affirmation asymmetries, what Joe Stiglitz got the Nobel Prize for, so the state might have to come in and fund those things that are hard to fund because of these information asymmetries like SME financing. So it's not that these things don't exist, but thinking about them in terms of bandaging things up, you wait for something to mess up and then you come in, bang, fix that problem, is not going to get us sustainable growth. It's not going to get us inclusive growth. It's definitely not going to get us the SDGs, and it didn't get us the GPTs, the general purpose technologies, whether it was mass production, aviation, nanotech, biotech, internet, and today, the green tech stuff, and this is what I've written a lot about in other areas. So, what do we do? Now, what I want to argue is that we need a fundamentally different way of thinking about the economy. And this is partly why I resist the word regulating the economy, because that doesn't disrupt the narrative of where the economy comes from. And I've personally been very inspired by the work of Karl Polanyi around this. He wrote this fantastic book in 1944 called The Great Transformation, where he basically argues that the free market itself, or how we think about the free market, and national markets, and the capitalist market, which is not universal, it's very recent, it's about 250 years old, whereas local markets where you buy fruit and vegetables at the corner of a street, or international markets, big international trade, they have existed for a longer time than capitalism, but the national capitalist market was forced into existence by policy. This wonderful quote here where he said, administrators had to be constantly on the watch to ensure that the market mechanism actually worked. There's nothing natural about it. And if you kind of step back and say, that's equally true, and he also talks about this, that without labor institutions that were also fighting to make sure that markets were operating in such a way that people's livelihoods were not being damaged and actually creating decent work, well-paid work, focused on working conditions, those struggles themselves, the struggles that got us the weekend, not bad as a social innovation, the 8-hour workday, not bad, were active in co-creating and co-shaping markets. It wasn't about the market is there, and then you have to go in and regulate it to get those conditions right. The market itself is an outcome of those struggles, of policy, of labor movements, and of course of the private sector, but that bit we know. And so what I do in this book on value, and sorry, it's not meant to be a self-promotional talk, I just think it's a good book, was to kind of go back not as an academic exercise, but as kind of a call to action exercise, to look at just how different things were when this notion of value, where does value actually come from? How is it co-created? What are the different forces, the objective forces that are actually needed for it to happen? This isn't necessarily a normative point. There's lots of bad value that can be generated, but just value created in the economy and where do markets come from. What it was like when it was actually at the center of economic reasoning, which since the much greater focus on the subjective nature of decision making and the confusion of price with value, this debate was lost. So I'm going to give you a quick tour for those of you who didn't read history of economic theory in your degree, of why this is really important. And so try not to get bored. In the 1600s, so what's interesting here, and this is just obvious, in each of these century, God, I can't think, centuries, the way that value was thought about was related to what was actually happening in the economy. So the 1600s, this is the years of the 1651 Navigation Acts. There was lots of emphasis on trade, exchange, the trade acts of the time. Kind of Trump has brought us back to that era basically by just focusing on walls and exchange and getting the terms of trade right. But what happened in the 1700s and the 1800s was the emphasis left exchange and really went to production. And this was not deterministic. If you read the physiocrats and the classical economists, you really see just how much they paid attention to change. It was all about change. So in the case of the physiocrats, they were looking at, because it was the agricultural society, at the nature of farm labor. And they really believed that farming was the source of value. And so they were fascinated by what actually was required to increase the productivity of the land. And they made what I call the first spreadsheet ever. That's supposed to be a spreadsheet there, called the Tableau Économique, Francois Canet, and I've translated it here for you so you can see it a bit better, where they actually divided the economy into different classes based on their notion, though, that farm labor was the center. And they called the farmers the productive class. And then you had the merchants who were just selling the goods produced on the farm. These were the proprietors. And then you had the landlords, who they really worried about. And the reason they did this whole calculation is they were worried about the degree to which the funds being generated at the center of the value creation process could potentially be siphoned out, even for those areas that were useful, like you actually had to sell this stuff, the proprietors. If too much money just went to the exchange of the goods created and not plowed back into making the land more productive, and also making sure that the farmers had something to live on and were themselves taken care of, then the system itself would risk its reproduction. And notice the word reproduction. This is why they called the landlords the sterile class. Right? This is like a sexual reproductive terminology. So if too much money is siphoned out, think Goldman Sachs and finance, then you're risking the reproduction of the system. And what was interesting was that this focus on production and reproduction and different classes, who's doing what, who's then earning what, and what happens when too much money is siphoned out and not plowed back in, think of that reinvestment problem I was just talking to you about, was at the center of their economic reasoning. And similarly, the classicals who were writing in the 1800s, this is, of course, the time of the Industrial Revolution. Adam Smith was writing at the end of the 1700s, David Ricardo, Karl Marx, also the classical economists writing in the... God, I just realized a lot of you have these earphones on. I'm talking way too fast for the poor translator, so let me just apologize now. They also focused on the objective conditions, but inside the factory, basically. So they really believed that labor was at the center of value, and they differentiated this productive versus unproductive labor, but they were especially interested in what was actually going on in production. So for example, Adam Smith, the division of labor, he had this famous pin factory example where he showed that if you actually increase the division of labor to the different tasks that are required, for example, in making a pin, 18 different tasks, instead of one worker creating one pin a day, they could create, I can't remember the number, I want to say 18,000, but I might have just made that up. Anyway, some much larger number than one, thousands of pins a day because of that increase in productivity that came from the division of labor, which produced an increase in growth, which then aggregated up, produced the wealth of nations, his book. And David Ricardo also focused a lot on this issue, and he was one of the first, by the way, David Ricardo, in 1821, he was asking the kinds of questions people are asking today about the robots. He was saying, hold on a second, with this industrial revolution, you have an increase in machinery, you have an increase in the capital-labor ratio, mechanization. It is, in fact, labor displacing. What's going to happen? And then Adam Smith used that also to think about what happens to the source of profits, which is labor exploitation, when machines are replacing labor. Anyway, they focused a lot on technological change. And by the way, just in case I forget to say something about this, what then happened for 200 years, machines did displace labor. They were often creating unemployment. They were often de-skilling people because of this increase in, if you want, the division of labor itself, which rendered many jobs much more simple. But as long as profits were reinvested back into another part of the economy, then that creative destruction word that we often hear about innovation also happened in terms of labor. Some jobs were lost, other jobs and new skills were formed, but they didn't happen kind of naturally. There was no deterministic a factor behind that. That was a result of the investment process itself. Skills and jobs are outcomes of course, the struggles in the labor movement, but also investment itself inside business has been critical for skill creation, which then gets damaged because of that type of reinvestment issue I raised before. Anyway, so the classicals, both Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, what they focused on was very much, they focused first on a theory of value, again, tied to production, mechanization, division of labor, and that turned into their theory of price itself. And there was, this famous labor theory of value, which I won't go into. Fundamentally, they focus on production and the objective conditions of production, the relationship between production and income, so profits, interest, rents and wages, was mediated also through power issues. The power issues themselves, who own the means of production, was, if you want, an objective lens as well. And their focus, like that of the physiocrats, was on that reproduction of the system, something the mercantilists didn't really care too much about. And really interesting, rent, this word rent, which I'll come back to for the classicals, was basically unearned income. So because they focus on the objective conditions, who's doing what? Where are the workers placed? How is the organization of labor occurring? Where are the merchants? Where are the landlords? They really did also look at rent in terms of some of the income being generated just from moving stuff around, actually creating nothing new. And they differentiated profits from rents, something that Schumpeter himself also later built on in this notion of Schumpeterian profits versus Ricardian rents. And so what happens with neoclassical economics, right? So the mercantilists focused on exchange, the physiocrats on farm labor, the classicals on industrial labor, is they focus on preferences. And you might remember this from even basic economics. So the individual maximizing an individual decision. So consumers maximizing utility, firms maximizing their profits, labor, workers maximizing their choices versus leisure versus work. And wages themselves being an outcome of that individual choice. So out overnight goes the class struggle. Wages are determined by this individual maximization decision. We have a massive transformation from a view on the objective conditions of production, fueled by innovation, lots of change, but still was objective, actually looking at, okay, how is this kind of production system working, and what happens if too much is being siphoned out? So from objective to subjective. And fundamentally, this is a big revolution. Even students who study economics don't realize this. Massive revolution from a system where the focus was on value, which then determined a theory of price. We all of a sudden have a body of thought that focuses on prices and that reveals what's valuable. So as you know, as was just being hinted at, we only include in GDP even what has a price. And then we determine that as valuable and we put that into our national income and product accounting. And really key, even some progressive economists still who are neoclassical, but if you want, trying to also address important issues around inequality, et cetera, the neoclassical body of thought no longer looks at rent as unearned income, but simply as some sort of temporary, transient monopoly power that leads you not to have competitive prices. So in theory, it can be competed away. And that's not unuseful, that's also useful. Of course, we need to be looking at monopolies and what determines monopoly power, but this idea that unearned income is impossible to really understand in a body of thought that is fundamentally focused on the subjective individual maximizing decisions, so confuses prices with values and profits with rents. This notion of unearned income isn't there anymore. And this notion that it's actually prices that determine value is what then allows, coming back, think of that point about Plato that I said before, the storytellers rule the world. Sorry, something is missing on this slide, which is who said this crazy quote. This was the CEO of Goldman Sachs, Lloyd Blankfein, 1 year after the crisis in 2009, dared to say, without trying to make anyone laugh, this was not an after-dinner joke. He was like, completely serious, just Google it, you'll see it, big FT article about this. Goldman Sachs workers are the most productive in the world. This is 1 year after they were fined $10 billion, no one went to jail, by the US government for what they basically contributed to, which is the financial crisis due to all the dodgy mortgage products where the underlying risk was hidden, and the role that Goldman Sachs and other investment banks had in that. This bold, really kind of confident statement, we are the most productive in the world, he's right. In terms of how we actually measure value, they are earning the most. And because of all the problematic ways in which we confuse then price with value, and wages themselves being the price of labor, then it's, of course, he's absolutely right. If we accept that price equals value, if we accept the underlying assumptions in neoclassical economics, then actually the statement sounds pretty right. Now, what I want to argue in the limited time I have is that this really matters. Questioning these issues really matters for some of the biggest fundamental problems we have today around inequality, around GDP, how it's calculated, how we can make better choices about how to measure output, governance of organizations, the whole issue of shareholder maximization causing a massive problem in terms of reinvestment of profits in the economy, which I talked about, the pricing of essential goods like medicines, increasing often 1,000% overnight, and being told that this is the right thing to do in order to please shareholders, the whole notion of how to govern the digital platform capitalism, which Uma has been writing about, and I definitely want to talk to you more about later in terms of what the ILO has been thinking about this, but what tools we even think we have in order to govern this process and co-create platform capitalism in different ways comes also back down to these value issues, and the role of the state in terms of that big fifth problem or fourth problem that I mentioned of not having the right tools. So let me just kind of go down this quickly. I'm not going to talk so much about the inequality because it was already addressed, and it's, I think, quite understood that if you have a theory of value which confuses prices with value, then it's going to be almost impossible to really think about what is the right wage for what workers are actually doing. So this notion of this graph that I showed in the beginning of productivity rising, wages stalling, and partly that's why so much debt also had to be taken out, because living standards weren't raised. This fundamentally comes also down to a notion that we don't understand what labor is even doing in the production process. We only think of that in terms of very limited notions of productivity, but very little in terms of the collective value creation process that's required in 21st century capitalism. Now, GDP, I'm going to come back to the inequality issue in a minute. That's also why I'm sort of skipping over it for now. GDP, on the one hand, it's the issues that were already raised, so we don't count, all the things that have value, but we don't have a price. So care in the home. Feminist economists, by the way, have been writing about this for many years. Similarly, environmental economists have reminded us how crazy it is that when we pollute, GDP actually goes up because we have to clean it up. We have no real measure still of showing with GDP what happens when we pollute in terms of the value in the economy being destroyed. Similarly, if you marry your cleaner, GDP, or dog cleaner, or any kind of cleaner in the house, if that work continues to be done but it's no longer paid for, GDP goes down. It's nonsensical, right? What is less understood, and I want to bring this back to rent, which hasn't been highlighted in these discussions. I think neither the feminist economists nor the environmental economists have kind of honed in on one of the key problems, which is not just what to add to GDP, but what to take out. I have a rule in my house, because I've got 4 kids, every time you bring something in the house, 2 things have to leave. I think we should do something similar with GDP. Take out the rent before we add in the happiness. What's really interesting, and this should sort of signal why it's useful to go back to some of this objective analysis of the physiocrats and the classicals. In 1970, not that long ago, most of finance was not even included in GDP. Only those bits of finance that you paid a fee for. So if you bought a mortgage or got a mortgage, the fee you paid to the mortgage provider went into GDP because we only include things that have a price. But net interest payments didn't. That was literally still seen just in 1970, not long ago, as a transfer. They didn't use the word unearned income of the classicals, but that basically was the reasoning. So in the same way that we don't include social security payments, rent was not included. And then those figures started to appear, like the ones I showed you in the beginning of Andy Haldane, just the size of this beast growing. So the financial sector growing much faster than the other parts of the real economy. And instead of just pausing and saying, ooh, what's going on there? What is this sector doing? It was just given a name, and the net interest payment was used as the price for that activity. So this occurred in different areas, but especially in the UN, United Nations. They have a group that does the systems of national accounting, the SNA. They just literally gave it a name. So they called what investment banks do risk-taking. Then we know what happened when the risks were taken and everything happened with the crisis coming about. They were all bailed out, so we see who the real risk taker is in terms of who bailed them out. But anyway, investment banks were the risk takers. That went into national income and product accounting. Those net interest payments were the price earned minus the costs. And commercial banks, financial intermediation. So what's really interesting in terms of GDP, that actually doing what I'm saying, which is let's make sure we also take stuff out and make that distinction, is something actually being created. Or is there lots of unearned income, things just moving around? It's not about blaming finance and saying the whole sector is messed up, but a diagnosis of what's actually happening in the sector. What is finance doing? Is it nurturing capital development in the economy and growth in the economy, for example, providing patient long-term finance to those few firms even willing to engage with innovation? And if not, if it's just financing itself, should we think about that in terms of how we actually include it into GDP. Similarly, the big discussion that is not new around governance of organizations and the whole problems around shareholder maximization and the need for stakeholder governance, which really recognizes the work of workers and having trade union representatives on the boards of companies, what in some Scandinavian countries they still have, what in some parts of the world is being discussed, unfortunately not enough. That is impossible to do unless we debunk also the underlying theory of value behind maximizing shareholder value. If we just say it's unfair, it leads to short-termism, it leads to speculation, it leads to not enough being reinvested back in the economy, well, so be it. I mean, if there's a strong theory of value behind it, well, let's maybe bear with the consequences and then some value will be created. And if you look at that literature, which began in the 1980s, this was a huge revolution, as I mentioned before, changed the Ricardian understanding of, or not understanding, of what actually was happening with profits and what, mechanization, not the robots, but the governance of organizations being at the center of this problem between innovation and work. What you read in that literature is a particular notion of who the shareholder is in terms of being a value creator. Very specifically, they're seen as being the biggest risk takers. They are the residual claimants. Residual is what's left over, the extra, right? So everyone else in the economy has a guaranteed rate of return. These are all words in the textbook. Read Michael Jensen. So the notion that the state has a guaranteed rate of return, that banks through the interest rates have a guaranteed rate of return, that workers through their salaries have a guaranteed rate of return, and at the end, if there's something left over, the shareholders kind of deserve it. It's their just dessert because they took the most risks. It's that needs to be debunked. It's not sort of the symptoms of that, of then what they do through the share buybacks I showed you before. So who has a guaranteed rate of return? The government, definitely not. Just look at what it did recently with the green economy, putting, this is in the case of the US government, $500 million given to Tesla, $500 million given to Solyndra. Solyndra goes bust, taxpayer comes in and bails them out. Tesla is a success. That is the same with almost any government investment. For every success, you will have to bear the risk that maybe 6 or 7 of your projects actually fail. But whereas the venture capitalists admit that, they are the big risk takers, because we don't really have an understanding of public value, and not just in terms of regulating, intervening, facilitating, fixing market failures, but being a co-creator of wealth itself through a collective understanding of wealth creation, then the risks the state takes isn't understood. Workers, same thing. So many workers might enter a job and actually accept that they get paid less in the beginning because they think they have a lifelong career in a company. There's no guarantee that's going to happen. That's a risk itself, right? And there's all sorts of different ways that you could think about the risk-taking activities in the labor force, which are completely dismissed by this particular theory of value that's behind shareholder maximization. Pricing of medicines is one of the most absurd areas where, why is it absurd? Because it's actually the best, most symbolic, how do you say, it's a great example of how things can go wrong when you confuse prices with value. And there's actually a theory that explains why prices of drugs are so high called value-based pricing, which is basically to allow prices to reveal how much you value a drug by not having the drug. And I would prostitute myself to pay for a drug that my kids really need if I can't pay for it. So the value, according to value-based pricing, leads to almost an infinite price. And when the price of an antibiotic just recently went up by 400% overnight, this was Nostrum Pharmaceuticals, the CEO was actually very honest about it. He said, well, we have the moral right to allow prices to go to what the market will bear in order to please the shareholders, in terms of that shareholder maximization, but the value theory we use to price medicines today actually justifies that, completely ignoring that actually most of the high-risk fundamental research behind many of these drugs actually comes from public institutions globally. In the US, the government spends over $30 billion a year for drug research and somehow never thought about making sure the prices of the drugs reflect that collective value contribution. Pretty mad. And again, Goldman Sachs always comes out with these wonderful quotes that one can use. Is curing patients a sustainable business model? Well, definitely not if you're going to rely on these crazy prices. And of course, in Europe, where we have welfare states, you're still paying for it. It's just the state that comes in and, again, subsidizes something that it's already paid for. The whole data question is also very interesting because as important as taxation is, and it's central, by the way, when we don't tax, we don't have the funds to actually fund the critical areas that we need to create the kind of public goods around public education, public health, et cetera. But even tax, it's not enough in terms of really disrupting and being a thorn in the side to these underlying misunderstood value principles. So the idea that the data and the tech, these tech companies are creating, if you want, wealth, which then we need to worry about privacy, which is a massive issue. And Uma was telling me she's been doing some great work with her colleagues around privacy as well, and taxation. It's not enough. We have to disrupt the relationships between, well, who is actually creating value? So if you think of the technology that's used to retrieve the data, whether it's Google or Uber, it was publicly financed, internet, GPS, both public funded technologies, and the data is of citizens. Every time you click on Citymapper, you are generating data. What's interesting is there's some experiments worldwide, like in Barcelona and Amsterdam, and now it's also starting in New York at the city level. It's interesting how cities are becoming agents of provoking these value relationships. Why not just question, why do they have the data in the first place? Yes, there's a privacy question, but why don't we rethink new governance, new institutional relationships where, for example, the city, and this is what they're doing with Ada Colau's, she's the mayor of Barcelona, how the city could actually co-host and govern with different actors a repository of the data that is created by the citizens in Barcelona, which then directly fuels innovation, social innovation around public transport. But that requires, in the first instance, questioning why is the data even housed in the companies? And fundamentally, that comes down to these narratives that have not been debunked about where wealth is created. And the role of government, what's incredible about that Blankfein quote about Goldman Sachs being the most productive, as I already said, he can say that because of how we do accounting. But we've kind of set up government to be screwed by this process. So the way we actually include, for example, public education is just the salaries, the costs of the teachers, not the value that's actually created from a well-structured, properly functioning, dynamic public education system. So because it's free. So that price problem that we only include things that have prices also end up creating, if you want, a performativity, as sociologists would call it. How we measure something creates a lot of arrogance in some parts of the economy. I'm a value creator. And literally, logistically, on the accounting side, teachers cannot say that. Not because they're only less confident than the Goldman Sachs guys and girls, but because we don't measure the output of what they've produced, only the input. And if you look at this problem of market fixing, market shaping that I mentioned before, kind of too little, too late, always out of breath, trying to fix the problem after it arises, you know, this is also part of the problem, that we don't actually have a theory of public value creation. We talk about social value in economics, but that's just an aggregation of lots of individual decisions. And we have things like public goods, but public goods are just corrections for the positive externality problem. They're not an objective in terms of how it's framed in traditional economics. And how we train bureaucrats worldwide make the word bureaucratic a really bad word. How many of you say, oh, it's so bureaucratic? Whereas, you know, sexy bureaucracies, dynamic, creative bureaucracies, why not? But that would require training bureaucrats completely outside of the value theory that they're fed, even to do good things like pollution, because they're fed through new public management and public choice theory, which fundamentally accepts these problematic notions of value in traditional economics. And so this need for a revived, a stronger, dynamic, interesting conversations around a human-centered social contract, around capabilities, about institutions, and new types of incentives and contracts that actually get us the kind of outcomes we want, has to, I think, be nested within this discussion. And these are just the wonderful graphs in the report, which I'm sure you've read. So what we've tried to do in the institute I've set up, and I'll just say something in the last 5 minutes I have about this, is to really bring this notion of collective value creation, kind of stakeholder governance for real, you know, creating new frameworks to guide the micro, the meso, and the macro levels of the economy at the center of how we think about economics. And even bringing back this notion of public value to really be debated and to turn into a practice-based way of thinking of value as collective. And so, so what I want to argue is that there's lots we can do. This is, by the way, why I don't subtitle the book Makers versus Takers, because that's just like us versus them. Bad stuff versus good stuff. The makers are good, the takers are bad. It's making versus taking. There's lots of agency. We can fundamentally transform how value is created in the system, which, first of all, needs to be started with the notion of collective value creation. We have to do exactly what the report talks about in terms of the capabilities of institutions and new relationships. But that needs to be positioned not in terms of creating more fairness, less inequality, and just transitions, but in order to co-create that value. And we use words like flourishing, which are really important. I like that word. I don't want to dismiss it. But we have to bring it to the center of how we think about economic growth itself. We need to govern all the institutions of work, but also all the different institutions, also with dynamic conditionalities, and I'll come back to that more later. In other words, it's not just that we need, you know, to rethink corporate governance, like the problems with shareholder value maximization, but that's a bad deal. The excess of the share buybacks that I talked about before are because it's allowed. And given all these different types of public investments and social investments and labor investments and time and energy that businesses have access to, the need to, for example, even just do the minimum, reinvest your profits should be a condition in order to access a collective and social ecosystem. Markets can be fundamentally reshaped and co-created, and we should question a bit words like regulating markets, because that immediately makes you think you're not really creating that market, you're just regulating it, even though, you know, we have to work with the words we have, so we can just make regulation and define it much more specifically. It means being very careful not to take as given what the market is. Even in the area of health that I work a lot, when I mentioned before that the US government spends over $30 billion a year on health, it mainly is just drugs. It's almost all drugs. There's hardly anything on lifestyle. So the role of a public and third sector in terms of philanthropy institutions in that space should be to redefine the market. There's even little on diagnostics and surgical treatments that are less sexy than health, and than lifestyle changes. But the role of a public actor should be to redefine that space, and labor unions themselves at the table to define what is a green economy, what does it look like, and then also make sure that we have a just transition along the way to get there, but they have to be at the table to define and to be disruptive in how we even talk about green. And that's not independent of the power and confidence they will have and the tools they have at their disposal when they make sure also that it's a just transition. We need to steer activities into the production boundary. It's not about saying finance is terrible. Of course it's not terrible. Finance can be set up in really functional ways. It's crazy we don't have a financial transaction tax. It is not rocket science. We are still rewarding short-termism over long-termism. Capital gains is way too low in many countries, but especially how it's devised. We could even have zero capital gains if you hold your investment for 10 or 20 years, but much higher capital gains when it's just a quick investment. We haven't done that. In the UK, the Labour Party actually reduced the time that private equity had to be invested in order to get a capital gains tax reduction from 10 years to 2 years, with the narrative, this was Tony Blair's government, of we need more capital, we need more investment, we need more innovation. Again, the stupidest things happen in the name of innovation. Be careful. We need new financial institutions. I've been working with my team with lots of public banks around the world, and this whole notion in Keynes of socialization of investment, which kind of makes you think of all the different types of mutuals and cooperative kind of investments that might also be needed. But these can also be really mismanaged. So many public banks just become handout machines instead of really goal-focused around public value and making sure that they're picking, not winners, but picking the willing. Which companies are willing to help a city, a region, a nation, or transnational organization actually meet its societal objectives and to provide patient, long-term, committed, strategic finance in order to meet that goal, as opposed to just a handout to whichever sector asks for money the loudest. We absolutely have to rethink the stakeholder governance model, but putting this whole value creation thing at its core. And lastly, this notion that we should be focused on outcomes. Outcomes. Why? Because we will need to collectively create the value, but what value? People sometimes, I sometimes give the positive examples of what government funded. Everything in your smartphones, internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri, all publicly financed, but we also finance through our governments lots of bad stuff. Not just wars that kill a lot of people, but even fracking, shale gas, the technology, all came from government. Now that's not necessarily bad, I'm not an expert, but it's amazing how all the debate about fracking and shale happened after the fact. And that's not independent of the fact we don't even have a framework through which to understand this kind of transformative power of all these different organizations. So we should have forums, the social dialogue as a public good itself, of what is being financed in the first place. Not just making sure that also workers are getting their right share of the rewards that are determined. We need also bodies of the workers' voices and other civil society voices through our democratic governance procedures to be actively debating what the hell are we creating? What is this transition? Is it good? Is it bad? What are these new technologies that are coming about? And so for this area of missions, I've been working quite a lot recently, but first, before I go into that, the concept of missions and what it could mean for, I think, what the ILO is also trying to do in terms of bringing back not just a human-centered focus, but this real need for collective bargaining and collective social dialogue to be at the core of that. I'll say something about that in a minute. But just in terms of being a thorn in the side of the relationships, what's extraordinary is if you're not seen, and if you don't have that social dialogue, contested dialogue, conflictual debate from the beginning, then how we even think about the rewards gets affected. So it's easy to say workers need their fair share, but if we don't have a framework that really explicitly talks about the risks that labor organizations and public organizations take, then it's very easy to fall into the trap of socializing risks and privatizing rewards, because the risk takers need to get their reward. And Bell Labs, which was one of the most innovative private R&D laboratories in the history of capitalism, came from an era where the US government was much more confident about negotiating a deal, let alone the Green New Deal, just a deal. So AT&T, which had a monopoly, had to reinvest its profits back into the real economy, back into innovation, back into big innovation beyond telecoms in order to maintain its monopoly status. Similarly, with patents, what are patents? I don't like the word IPR because it sounds like it's a right you get from God, intellectual property rights. It's a state-given right, not God-given right. For 20 years, we badly negotiate them because what the state gets from a patent is more diffusion, more deployment once the patent is up. But if it's been badly negotiated because the state kind of doesn't really get its role and has become very unconfident through this notion as just fixing market failures, then we get into the situation we're in where patents are way too wide. They're used for strategic reasons, way too upstream. We're actually patenting, privatizing the tools of research, and also way too strong, very hard to license. So what the society should get from giving a 20-year monopoly to a company, they don't get, because once the 20 years are up, you've actually really stifled the innovation process doing what William Baumol called producing unproductive, not productive entrepreneurship. There's all sorts of other things that could be done to make sure we socialize the rewards, not just the risks. There's, we do income contingent loans for students. We often don't do that for companies. But also really understanding the state as a risk taker and the state not as Uncle Sam, but the collective agencies we have in the state to actually have a portfolio, to explicitly admit for many of your successes you will have many failures, and making sure that the state gets some of the upside from the successes in order to cover the inevitable downside and the next round, which they didn't do with the financial crisis. They just kind of bailed out the banks, and then once they were making record level returns, they didn't get back that risk adjusted interest. That could actually help replenish, not only through taxation, get the tax system right for sure, that's kind of obvious, but that could replenish the coffers to actually fund so many of the social goals that I'm sure that you'll be talking about over the next 3 days. Paying back into some sort of common innovation fund. Google's algorithm was funded by the National Science Foundation. Even a grant, there's no reason that the grants we give could not say something like, all right, if things go bad, no problem. The state has taken the risk. Larry and Sergey, what was his name? I was going to say Sergio, but that's Italian. But if things go well and you make X billion, then a certain percentage comes back into a common fund to fund the next round. None of that. And by the way, with prices, it's actually in the Bayh-Dole Act, which in 1980 allowed publicly funded research to be patented. In that act, if you read it, it's a big act, it says the state should have the right to cap the prices of those drugs that are publicly financed. So the citizens who finance them actually have access. They've never exercised that right. And that is a massive failure of the confidence, and that is not independent of the fact that even in countries where they make the investments, they don't have the confidence to get the right deal because of these narratives. So in this work on missions, again, 1 minute on this, the idea is to really put that at the core of how we think about policy making, so that we don't just do SME financing or sector-based or a little problem here and there, but to really focus, use this opportunity I mentioned in my opening minute about the Sustainable Development Goals, transform them into concrete objectives in each member state, which will often be context-specific, and make sure that we have a concrete goal in order to achieve a broad challenge or different concrete goals, which require lots of different sectors and actors and disciplines to invest and innovate and transform the power of government, procurement, prizes, grants, equity, loans, to fuel the bottom-up experimentation that's required. So the moonshot, this is the 50th anniversary this year, required lots of different sectors. Over 12, nutrition, textiles, not just aeronautics, and 300 projects had to be funded to get there, of which many failed. So this kind of explicit recognition that risk-taking and trial and error is a process that we all have to accept. And so, the Clean Oceans, SDG 13, transforming it into something very specific, like getting the plastic out, or the climate change challenge, something very specific, like carbon neutral cities, and really requiring lots of different sectors to invest and innovate, and making that a condition of getting any public subsidy. So recently in Germany, for example, the steel industry reduced its material content through repurpose, reuse, and recycle as a condition of getting loans from the public bank, the KfW, instead of just a bailout to steel, which is what the English steel industry is now asking for, or the coal industry in the US just getting massive subsidies and having tariffs come in to supposedly helping them with no strong incentive to change. And again, using procurement to really fuel that bottom up. You know what's interesting with Fiat, which is a company in Italy which has not invested, it's quite inertial, has not benefited from any kind of strong public goal-oriented and conditionalities in place. When Fiat went to America to buy Chrysler, which was bailed out by the public sector like the banks, Obama, in a rare moment of confidence, said, in this country, here's Chrysler, here's the price, it's ours, we bailed them out, it's public, but in this country, you are going to invest in hybrid technology. And Sergio Marchionne, who passed away recently, was like, all right, because that was the condition. So whereas in Italy, all the focus is on subsidies and guarantees, and it creates a really parasitic public-private, and workers don't benefit because there's no conditions attached to any of the benefits that Fiat receives from the Italian government in terms of investing in training, in skills, in R&D, in making these plants actually have a long-run growth strategy. In the US, Fiat just changed and actually invested in hybrid technology, which it didn't invest in Italy. But that was a condition attached to any sort of interesting deal. So I'm finished. Sorry if I spoke too much. I think that these questions are central to actually bringing the social contract to be a dynamic way in which different actors in the economy co-create the wealth and make sure that it's fair, it's inclusive, that people are being invested in. But in order to flourish and really provide this collective value creation process to be kind of, to actually have a roadmap to get there versus what unfortunately in many places just becomes a talk shop.